Blessings, everyone. This is Reverend Aphren with the Four Pillars Temple. So I'm coming to you today because I want to teach you about how we make the ritual wear in the Four Pillars tradition. So the base garment that we use for our tradition is a robe, and we use a coat, which indicates a person has been initiated into one of the 3 degrees. So the green coat that we use is the same coat for all 3 of the degrees. Once you've been initiated from a lay member into a clergy member, your robe color changes. So in this case, because today we're going to be talking about making the coat, keep in mind that the robe we're referencing is the black robe. So there are other pieces that go along with it, but today I'm going to teach you how we create the green coat that goes with the robe for members of the clergy in the Four Pillars tradition. Alright, so before we get started, I just want to say that the information that I'm going to provide for you in this video is meant for individuals who've never done sewing before or who haven't done a lot of sewing. So the intention is that I'm going to walk you through step by step so that if you're not comfortable with using machines or using equipment, this is going to orient you to all of that, and it's going to prepare you to do what you need to do to complete the project. So the first thing that you're going to need is obviously a pattern. So I have a couple of patterns here that I use for all the work that I do, because it's kind of fallen on me in our head temple to do all of the regalia. So you'll see here that the first one is a pattern for the robe itself. So what I use is I actually use Simplicity. And the number is 5840. 5840 Simplicity Costumes for Teens and Adults. And the pattern that I actually use is this one right here. So this is actually a cape or a cloak, but what I do is I make it as it's supposed to be made and I sew it up the front. So now it's a solid piece, a robe. It is very big and it uses a lot of fabric, about 8 yards of fabric. So it is a bit large, but it's a one size kind of fits all. Depending on your height, you might have to hem it pretty deeply. That is not what we're going to be talking about today. Today, what I'm going to show you is how, again, to make the green emerald coat that goes over the robe. And so the pattern that I've used for this is actually this pattern here. This is a Simplicity Costumes pattern, and I use 4213. Now, there's a lot of different patterns that are in this one, so I'm going to show you how to read it and kind of where we go from here. So the pattern that I'm actually using is this one here. See that brown coat that goes over top the robe? That's the style of pattern that I'm using. So that is actually pattern 6. It says there, pattern 6. You'll see it. You can barely see it because it's a little blurry, but it's right there next to the robe, to the coat rather, pattern 6. So on the back side, it gives you all the information that you need in order to be able to make this pattern. So what I do is I just use the largest size, and then I tailor it to fit the person. It's kind of a one size fits all in this regard as well. So the way you read it is on the left-hand side, it'll show you the different pattern pieces, right? So we're looking for 6, which is actually right there, right above my thumb. The problem is that it's actually showing, I'm going to zoom in, it's actually showing the back side of it. So if you look, this is actually the back side as opposed to the front side, which is right there, right? So you can kind of see the front side of it a little bit better right there. So, again, we're going with 6. So we're going to look here, and we're going to look for number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6 coat. So we see number 6 coat, and what it's telling us is it's saying, hey, if you're using 45 inches or 60-inch fabric, this is the amount of yardage you'll need in order to get the different sizes. So I go all the way to the extra large size, and then I come down to the coat number 6, and it says I need 2 7/8 yards. So I just get 3 yards. So you'll need 3 yards of fabric for this. Now, because I make so many of these, because again, it kind of falls on me to do all of the work and the sewing in the temple. What I do is I've actually just taken this pattern and I've copied the pattern onto a piece of thick butcher paper, which is basically craft paper. So I'm going to zoom out so I can show you what that looks like. And so this is my pattern right here. And it's not going to look like much because it's just a piece of paper. But what I've done is I went ahead and I did all of my designs on this so that anyone who has this pattern can use this, can make the garment as it's kind of written. So I'm actually recording this video after I've cut it out, so I won't be able to show you what it looks like cut out. But what I can do is I can kind of walk you through the process. So in order to do the cutting, what you'll need is you'll need the pattern. So if you happen to have, if you live near a craft store and you can get yourself this pattern, go ahead and do that. You can buy it on Amazon. A lot of craft stores have sales on their patterns, and you can get them for just a couple of dollars, like $1.99 or $2.99. So look for those sales, find that sale. And then after you have the pattern, you're going to need some straight pins. You're going to need fabric scissors. Notice I said fabric scissors. And you're going to need snips, which is what you're going to use for when you're actually doing the sewing. So those are the things you're going to need. And then obviously you're going to need a matching color thread. So what I like to use for the robes, all of the robes that I make, is I like to use, this color is a little darker than I intended for it to be, but the color that I use is like an emerald green or like a, even a hunter green. I think this one's actually hunter because I couldn't find emerald, but I always use broadcloth. Now, broadcloth is a mix of polyester and cotton. It's normally cheaper by yardage to the cotton, and it holds better when it comes to wrinkling. Cotton wrinkles very easily when you pack your robe up and put it away after ritual. It can wrinkle very easily. So I try to go with a broadcloth. So when you're at the fabric store, you want to look at the end of the roll or the bolt of fabric. You want to look at the end, and it'll tell you exactly what it's made out of. A lot of fabric stores will separate their cotton by their polyester, by their broadcloth, by, they'll put them in sections. But if you're confused, just look at the end of the bolt, and you'll see it says on the end, 80% cotton, 10% polyester, or whatever it is, right? And it'll even say on there, symphony broadcloth, so you'll know that's what it is. So I got my broadcloth, I got my pattern, which I'm going to show you in just a second, and then we got all the stuff we need. So let's go ahead and take a look at the pattern. All right, so looking at the pattern here, here's what we got going on. Now, this pattern, again, is not my pattern. I copied it from that design, but essentially it's just a big rectangle, and then on the one side, you'll notice that this edge is a little bit further out by like an inch or two. Other than that, it's just basically a rectangle, right? So a couple things you need to be mindful of with this pattern, and this is essentially what you'll see on the pattern from the store as well. This pattern is made using a type of paper that's almost like tissue paper, and it rips very easy, and if you're not careful, if you use it more than once, it can really become a mess. So that's why I transferred this pattern onto this craft paper. So the important thing we have to be mindful of is the grain line. This is what this thing is here. It's called the grain line. The grain line is the direction that the fabric was woven in, and so you may have heard the word warp and weft when it comes to a pattern. So if you think about a loom, right, you have strands or threads that are going this way, and you have strands or threads that are going that way, right? So one of them is the warp and one of them is the weft. Now, I always forget which is which. Essentially, though, you need to line the grain line up with one of those ways, right? Most fabric is sold on a bolt that is narrow. So because it's narrow, obviously you're going to line the grain line up with the long side, right? Technically, you could line it up with the short side, but this fabric and this pattern is too big to do that because, again, 45 inches. This is about 45 inches here, so you have to go in this direction. Anyway. So what I do is I put all of my directions on my pattern. So you'll see here that this is all that we need for the pattern. We're going to cut 3 of these. So what I do is I lay down my my fabric, and after I lay down the fabric, what I do is I just pin this down using my straight pins, right? So imagine I have my fabric down. I take my straight pins and I pin it going parallel to the edge of the pattern. If you go perpendicular, right, if you go this way, when you go to cut the fabric, you're going to cut into the pin, so you can't do that. So what you have to do is you have to pin it this way, and I pin it all the way around. It doesn't have to be like every inch or every centimeter. It can be like every 3 or 4 inches. Cotton doesn't really slip, or broadcloth doesn't really slip, so it's not a huge deal. So essentially you're going to just pin it all the way around, and then you cut it out just like you would paper, right? Like when we were kids, right? You just cut it out. Now here's the thing. This side of the pattern lines up with a fold, and it will say that on the tissue paper of the pattern. This cut 1 on fold means that you keep the fabric folded and you cut it so that when you open it up, it's twice as big, right? Because you're cutting it on a fold. The second one is you're cutting 2 more of these not on the fold. So then what you'll do is you'll just lay it in the middle of your fabric as best you can, and you'll just cut around it so that when you're done, you have 3. You have 1 cut on the fold, and you have 2 that are cut individually, right? If you keep the fabric folded, because when you purchase fabric, it comes folded. So if you keep it folded, the work is already done for you. You just have to line it up, cut it, and be done. Now, some people will wash their fabric before they cut it. I did not wash it this time. I did iron it though, and when I use patterns, I always iron my patterns too, so that the patterns are nice and flat, and I don't have to worry about them, changing the dimensions or messing up my cuts. So, what I've done already is I've went ahead and I've cut all of my pattern pieces using my pattern, and I'm ready to start sewing. So if you're confused about that, just refer back to the pattern, and the pattern will give you all of the information that you need. Alright, so please forgive the background. I am in my living room, and you may see the dogs running around or what have you, but so it is what it is. Okay, so in addition to the setup that we have here, so again, I have my snips, I have my scissors, I have my pins, and then I have my fabric. I obviously need a sewing machine, so I'm using a Singer heavy-duty sewing machine. In addition to that, I always keep my ironing board and my iron available. And the reason why is because when I'm working and I'm sewing, when you sew the seams together, after you've sewn the seams, you always want to press the seams open. This gives it a nice flat design. If you decide that you want to sew the seams shut just to make a nice finished edge, so it's not like raw and it's kind of like getting everywhere, you can do that, but you always want to iron the seam open first and then iron it closed, kind of going in both directions. After you do that, then you can sew it closed. And there's many different styles of how people do that. Sometimes they just sew the flaps together. Sometimes they sew it down. Sometimes they do what's called a French felled seam. Other times they do like a lap seam where they kind of tuck it in. All these different things can be done. But we're going to be as simple as possible with this because no one's going to be seeing the inside of our garment except us, right? So I don't have the ironing board up yet, but I will put it up because I will be needing it for this. Now, the great thing about the coat is because it's square, it's very easy sewing. So the way that I describe sewing is it kind of happens in two parts. The first part is what I call the construction part. So we're taking the raw pieces of the patterns and we're sewing them together to create a loose design, right? The second part is the finishing part. It's when I go back and I start adding all the finishing touches. I put the hems on, I put the, I sew down the, in this case we're going to be sewing down like the front, it's like almost like a, what we would call a placket. It's like a front facing that we sew down, just to kind of keep it nice and even. So we'll be doing that. When it comes to the hemming part, there is another tool called a hem gauge that we'll be using. So if this is all familiar to you, you can just kind of skip through this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sewing the garment. So again, there are 3 parts. This is just leftover that I had. There are 3 parts here. And so if you think about it, there's a back, and then there's 2 fronts, right? And then there's no sleeves, so there's going to be armholes that we're going to put our arms in, and then the coat's going to come down. So what we have to do first is we have to sew the back to the front. And I'm a little bit particular when I do any type of sewing, and this was kind of how I was educated. Fabric sometimes has a sheen to it, depending on the way that the fabric is woven. And so it might not seem like a big deal, you know, upside versus downside. It doesn't really make a difference, but it's always important that when you're cutting your patterns, that you cut them in the same direction so that they lay the same direction. If you cut one pattern with it going down, and then when you cut the other one, you do it going up. When you go to sew the garments together, it might look different. The sheen or the design might look different because it's laying differently than the way it was woven. So it's important for me to really keep an eye on that. So when I cut my pattern, I always cut it in like the same direction. And then I also make sure that I mark the front and the back of the garment. So again, when the yarn, or when the fabric comes, it comes folded and it's rolled on the bolt, right? So I consider the inside of the fold to be the wrong side and the outside to be the right side. So when I cut the fabric and I cut my pattern pieces, I'll use a straight pin and I'll mark the front sides of the pattern so that I know when I go to construct it in my first phase that I'm putting the right side to the right side. Right sides always go together. We sew it so the seam is on the wrong side, right? All right, so earlier when I was talking about the seams, I misspoke. There's actually what's called a French seam and another one called a flat-felled seam. It doesn't really matter. I just think it's important to be accurate. So the first thing that we're going to do is we have several pieces, right? So we have the front, the 2 fronts, and the back. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to prep the fronts. I'm changing the way I'm doing this. I realize I want to do this way first. So we are going to prep the fronts first. So this is the back. I'm just going to put it to the side for just a minute. Okay, so we have the 2 fronts. Now, if you look at the front, you'll see that it has... You'll see that it has 2 distinct parts, right? So if this is the front side of the fabric, which you may know it is because of that, the front side of the fabric, this is the little notch over here. If you can see that notch, that is the arm, right? And then this is the front side. So with this pattern, there is a front facing, which means that this part of the front, the long edge, has to get folded under. And that creates the facing. So the fold that it makes is about 2 inches, but we also have to make sure that we are doing it correctly, and in order to do that, we actually need to add what we call a seam allowance. So the seam allowance is going to be 5/8 inches. So what we're going to do, and essentially, is we're going to fold this under, and then we're going to fold it under again the 2 inches. So what it does is it creates a nice edge that's covered so that there's no raw edge right there, right? And then what we'll do is we'll sew it along that. So we're going to actually prepare both facings before we actually sew the garment together, just to make it easier. So again, we're going to do that. Now, you can do this in many different ways. You can use a hem gauge and measure 5/8 inches, and then after you measure the 5/8 inches, then you can iron it. You could do it that way, or you could even just use the sewing machine and sew it and create like a sewed edge, and then you can fold it right along that sewing, whatever you want to do. But I want to introduce you to another tool. This is called a hem gauge. Now, the hem gauge is basically just a ruler, and it has a little slider on it. So the slider will move. This end is like the measurement end, and you measure from this end. So if you do 5/8, you'll go exactly where I am. So there's 0 inches, and then there's 1/2 inch right there with that long piece, and then the one right after 1/2 inch is 5/8. So we do that, and then what we do is we just put it down and we roll the edge up to the mark where the hem gauge is. I'm going to zoom in so you can see. So you're essentially putting it and rolling it up. And then as you go along, you continue that, right? You kind of just roll it up to that and just mark that edge as you go along. So what I normally do is I'll use my iron and I will measure and then iron it really good. And then after I've gotten the seam allowance down, or the seam allowance down, then I will roll it I'll mark this to 2 inches, and then I'll roll it up to the 2 inches, and then I'll iron it completely flat so that we have a nice rolled facing and a completed nice edge. So we're going to go ahead and do that piece, and we'll move on. Alright, so here we are at the ironing board, and I do want to apologize because I gave you misinformation. I know it's hard to see, but actually it's not a 2-inch facing, it's actually a 2.5 inch facing, plus the 5/8 inch. So I'll show you exactly what that looks like. So remember, we're going to lay down our right side on with the right side facing down, and here's my nice long edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll it under 5/8, and I'm going to use my hem gauge, and I'm going to mark 5/8. So I'm going to lay it down, and I'm going to measure it just like that, okay, against the hem gauge, right up to the edge of that slider. And then I'm going to use my iron, and I'm going to iron it all the way down. So we'll go ahead and do that, and I'll show you a couple seconds of me ironing it all the way down, and then we'll move on. Just like this. And we just keep it, and if you're perfect, which I'm not, your edge will look nice and straight as you continue down. But as you can see, my edge here is not terribly straight. It's kind of jagged, which is part of the reason why we do this, because then we'll have a nice edge, right? So I'm going to go ahead and finish this, and then once I'm done, I will show you how we do the facing. All right, so now I've ironed it all the way down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to do it with 2.5 inches. Okay, so I mark 2.5 inches on my hem gauge, and then I'm going to take this. Notice that I have the, notice, I'm trying to show you, it's hard to like show you everything and nothing at the same time, right? So here it is. So again, I have it rolled up. I got my hem gauge up to 5/8 inch right there, right? And then I'm going to reset my hem gauge to 2.5 inches. And with this outer edge, right, I'm going to roll it up like that, up to 2.5 inches. And then I'm going to iron this all the way down as well. So I'm going to just use my hem gauge and just keep marking as I go down to make sure that it's the same width all the way down, and I got myself 2.5 inches here. So essentially what I've done is I've taken the edge that was a raw open edge, and I folded it under, and then I'm going to iron it here. So now it's all tucked in, it's nice and completed, there's no raw edges here, and then when I sew the top together, it's all going to be tucked in the top, and it'll be perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and iron the rest of this down, do the second front side, and I'll meet you back at the sewing machine for us to actually sew this together, and I'll show you what that looks like. All right, so I'm actually finishing up the second front piece of the, that's not the right one. The second front piece of the garment right now. So I thought instead of just having dead air, I would talk at you for a second. Okay, so here's the deal. When you are making the garment, you don't have to have a hem gauge. If you don't have a hem gauge, that's okay. You could just use a ruler. Plain ruler works fine. It's completely up to you. Whatever you have, don't panic if you don't have the right stuff. The other thing is that because we're using a polyester cotton blend, you want to make sure that you have the right setting on your iron. I remember when I used to work in the costume shop on campus back in the day, which is kind of where I got my start in sewing. I have a bachelor's degree in theater, and so I would do a lot of sewing on campus. And I remember my designer used to always tell us to keep our iron moving, to always move the iron. Don't let the iron stop because you can burn your fabric. But especially with cotton, it's really important to make sure that we have the right temperature, because otherwise it's not going to work. Cotton requires a high temperature to iron. So just be mindful of that when you're ironing, that you use the right setting, especially when we're pressing our seams and we need that nice, neat look. So just really, really be mindful. Most commercial, for home, not commercial, but irons for home will have settings on them and tell you exactly how high to make it in order to get the right for the right fabric type. So just be mindful of that when you're ironing, and you should be good to go. And the other thing I want to mention too is that because hem gauges are made out of aluminum, you can actually iron over them. So compared to like a regular ruler, when you kind of have to measure and then you move it and then you iron, hem gauges you can iron over top. So you can put it in the hem, fold it over like that, and just iron right over top of it. So it ends up being really handy, and they're not terribly expensive if you want to keep one in your All right, so we are back here at the sewing table, and we're going to go ahead and prepare to sew our facing so that we can move ahead with the rest of our garment. Now, so here's the facing that I have, right? So here's my garment. You'll see on this side here we have the facing. It's folded under, it's ironed nice and flat, and it's good to go. And it is 2.5 inches right there. Perfect. Now, the one thing I like about using a plastic table is the table I can use my pins on and it doesn't damage the table. Also, it's lightweight, except mine squeaks really bad. So what I do now is I want to pin this down so that I can sew along the edge. So what I use is I use regular pins. They have heads on them, and they have other ones that are made specifically for dressmaking or couture. It doesn't really matter what you use as long as you have something to hold this down. So what I do is I'll pin. So I told you before when you were cutting the fabric out to pin parallel to the cuts. When you're sewing, you want to pin perpendicular to the sewing, because we're going to sew down this way. You want to put your pins going this way. And the reason why is because I can sew over my pins. And when I sew over them, I don't have to worry about my fabric scooching. And it also gives me the opportunity to pull them out easier if I need to remove them. With some fabrics you don't want to pin and sew over. A lot of times things like silk or rayon or other fabrics that require that are a little bit more sensitive, you don't want to pin and sew over because it could damage the fabric, or it could put what we call like runs in the fabric. With cotton, it doesn't really matter. So as you can see, I'm not pinning terribly close together. I'm pinning every what is that, 3 or 4 or 5 maybe inches. Doesn't really matter, it's just to keep it in place. So I'm going to do this all the way down, and then once I get to the bottom, I'm going to bring it over to my sewing machine and I'll show you how we sew it. Alrighty, so here we are at my sewing machine, and we have our pieces here to begin sewing. Now, the easiest thing to do is to use some way to measure, okay? So I'm going to just kind of show you how it works. When we set the sewing machine up, I'm not going to teach you how to do that. If you don't know how to set the sewing machine up, you might need to refer to your manufacturer's instructions. However, in this case, we're going to go ahead and get started. So you set the stitch length, obviously it's a straight stitch, and you want the needle to be at the center. So one way to do this is, I'm bringing you in, so you'll see the needle is right here. What I can do is I can use my hem gauge, and I can measure from my hem gauge to wherever I need to go, which will give me where I need to put the fabric. So I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But in this case, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to use the width of the foot to help guide me, and if I didn't iron correctly and I didn't measure correctly, it's going to look wonky. So just be mindful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my sewing on the machine with this edge to the right. Okay, and the reason why is because I'm going to use the width of the sewing foot to measure this. So if you can't see, this is the edge of the fold, right? I'm going to put the edge of this edge of the foot on this edge of the fold, and I'm going to do a straight stitch all the way down. So it might be loud, but I'll show you. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stitch. And then you always want to do a reverse a couple, and then we're gonna, here we go. And so I'm gonna just go straight down, let the machine do what it does. And the important thing is we want to make sure that we're sewing close enough to this edge that we catch the fold under, right? So if you remember, we sewed it, or we ironed it down with a 5/8 seam allowance. So if you look here, 5/8 seam allowance is actually right to the edge of this foot, but where the needle is, we got plenty of room. We've given ourselves plenty of room. So as long as we're keeping the edge of the foot up with the edge of this, we will always catch that fold under, and we'll make that nice finished edge. So here we go. And here I am at the end of my first seam, and I'm going to just sew it right to the edge. When I get toward the edge, I'm going to reverse. So my reverse is actually up here. Some reverses are like down on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and just reverse a couple of stitches. And then, as they say, we're going to drive off the cliff. We're going to just keep on driving until it comes loose. Give it a little tug. And then what I do is I lift up on the foot, pull out some yarn, or thread rather. Now, I normally will use my snips, and I'll snip it off, but my sewing machine actually has a cutter on the side, so I basically just go like this, and I cut it off, and now I have my first seam. And I'm going to go back, and I'm going to take all these pins out. I'm going to go ahead and take all these pins out, put them back on my thing, right? So then I have my very first stitch, seam, right? And basically all this is doing is this is just keeping that front facing down, right? And then if we turn it over, we'll see that there is a line of stitches, but it's nice and flat. Now, as you can see, it's kind of wrinkled. That happens from the sewing. So we're going to take it back over to the ironing board, and we're going to iron it again before we move on to the next step. So do that to this, and then turn your attention to the second front, and do that also to the second front. And so that by the time we're done with this step, we now have the facing of the fronts sewn down with nice completed edges, and it's going to prepare us for the next step. This garment doesn't take a lot of steps. It's nice and easy. That's part of the reason why I like to use it for our attire, because it is nice and easy. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep on sewing, and I will see you back in a minute. Alright, so here we are back at the ironing board, and I'm going to just show you real quick. I'm just turning my iron on because it's sat too long. Here it is, right? So here is the garment. You'll kind of see that this is the edge where the seam is, right? Here's the little seam allowance, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to iron this nice and flat. Don't think too much about it. If you do have a steam iron, steam is really good, especially when we're doing this kind of work. It kind of loosens up the fibers, and it gets some of those wrinkles out from when we're sewing. So iron it nice and good. I like to just kind of roll it so it doesn't get creases in it, and then I'll kind of scooch it down a little bit more. Iron some more. And we're going to just iron this out, and then we're going to do the other front. So the great thing is it's repetitive on the left side as it is on the right side, because that's kind of what it is. We've got two sides, right? So we're going to keep doing this, and then we're going to do the part where we sew the fronts to the back. And if you remember, the part where we have this rolled under, this is obviously the back side. It's the inside of the garment. So this is the wrong side. The opposite of that would be the right side. So I'm going to go ahead and iron this second one, and then I will meet you back at the ironing, or at the sewing table, for us to move on with the next part of our garment. Okay, so the other reason why we iron with every step is because it's much easier to iron the pieces than it is to iron it all together once we're done. So, just as a recap, at this point we have cut our fabric, we've assembled the facings for our pieces, right? So we measured under, we folded, we ironed, we measured under the facings, we folded, we ironed. So, and then we sewed. Right, we sewed those two seams. So now we should have our two front sides. So just kind of as a recap, this is what it should look like. So this is the right side front. It's going to be like this, and then this is going to go like that, right? So once we have this, we can start assembling the front and the backs together. Alright, so I apologize, these angles are not the best. I am not a professional videographer, but here is the back side, and I've kept it folded up to this point, and you can see I have it marked. This is the right side. So I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to put the right side facing up, because right side to right side, right? So we got our right sides. Now, in this case, I'm looking for the right side front. So I'm going to find the right side, and I'm going to put the right side to the right side. So again, just to oversimplify it, this is the seam part. I know it's hard to see because it's the same color. This is the seam part that we sewed down, right? So that side's going up, and I'm going to mark them and put them together like so. And then we're going to, of course, line up these parts here, and we have it lined up. Now, I want to show you something. So we're going to take this side. My table's a little slippery, so we're going to take this side, and we're going to do the same thing. I just want to show you this. We're not going to move forward. So if I put these two sides together, might be hard to see because, again, it's the same color. Okay, so what I have, as it looks right now, is I have the back side facing up, I have the two front sides facing down, just laying on top with the tops aligned. You'll notice there's a gap here. That's where your neck goes, because the garment hangs straight down the front. So that's why I did the front That's why I did these front facings first, so that now we have an opening to put our head, right? If we don't do this first, then we sew them, and then now we're in a situation where we got to figure out what we're going to do with these. But doing it this way, these are already going to be here, they're going to be folded, and then we just sew right across the seam. Easy. So let's start with the one piece, the one side here. So we're going to do the same thing we just did. I'm going to turn it this way so you can see it. So what I'm going to do is we have the back and we have the front right laying on top. Well, the front side, I don't know if it's left or right. I think it's actually front left. Doesn't matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up these edges here. This is the arm, remember. I'm going to line it up. I'm going to line it up here. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the top seam first. So I'm going to pin this all the way down, going down this way, again, perpendicular to the seam. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch. Now, if you have your trusty ruler or hem gauge, you'll know what I'm talking about. That edge isn't lined up. If you don't, I'm going to show you what 5/8 looks like so that we can plan to sew. So bear with me for just a second while I pin this together, and we're going to come back in front of the sewing machine and I'm going to show you where we go. Alright, so here we are back at the machine. Now I want to show you how we do, how we measure the seam allowance. I'm going to get you down so that we can see you a little better. Okay, there we go. Get you down a little bit. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how we do the seam allowance. So you'll see right here is the needle, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to measure. And if you don't know how to do this, I'm going to show you how to do it with the hem gauge. So most machines, they have a plate right here, and this plate has little lines. You can't really see them, but there are little lines right here that tell you what the size or the length of the seam allowance is, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look for 5/8. If your machine doesn't have these little lines, which I've worked on machines that didn't, what I did was I measured it using the hem gauge, and then I put a piece of masking tape. And the masking tape helped me to remember, so as I was sewing, I sewed right along that masking tape. But my machine does have numbers, so I'm able to see what it is I'm doing here. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my fabric, right, and I've got it all pinned, and I'm going to line it up so that this edge is lined up with the mark for 5/8 on the plate. So my mark is right there, and then I'm going to just sew it like I normally do. I'm going to forward, backward, and then just sew, sew, sew. Now this is the top of the garment where the neck is, the neckline is. So for us, we are not going to sew all the way across because we're only sewing these two pieces together. So it's not a very long seam, and then once we get to the end of it, I'm going to show you what we're going to do at that point. So we get all the way to the end. I like to sew and then backspace over where I did the fold, just to add a little extra strength. And then you go all the way through, and when you get to the end, now remember this is the neck, so it's going to have a lot of wear and tear and tugging. So I will backspace again, backspace, backstitch again, and then I will go forward and I'll give myself a nice tack. That way, when this has a lot of pressure on it, it's not going to just unravel. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my other front piece, and I'm going to pin it here in the same way that I did over there, and I'm going to sew that down this way. And then when I'm done, we will have the shoulder seams completed. So I'm going to do that, and then I will come back when we've got the shoulder seams done. All right, so here I am, and I'm about ready to pin the other front to the back. So I got my back. You'll see there's the other part where I sewed over here, right, where it's attached with the shoulder seam. And then I'm going to find the right side to right side, and I'm going to line it up. And then down here is where the notch is. So I'm going to line up those notches, line up those edges, and then I'm going to pin it again all the way down. So while I do that, I'm going to tell you a story. So if any of you have ever been in theater, you know that theater people are very superstitious, right? We are incredibly superstitious, so it's no wonder that I had an inkling or an interest in theater, given the fact that I identify as a Wiccan, and I've practiced Wicca for over 20 years. So one of the things that we used to do in the costume shop, which is incredibly unsanitary, and I would not recommend that you do this like in your normal life, but when you're sewing your garments for a ritual, if it's something you want to do, I mean, I guess you could. So one thing that we used to do, I guess they didn't really support it, but there was kind of a joke that this is what they used to do back in the day. So if you're working on a garment and in the theater, and you're working on a garment and you pin your finger, poke yourself, whatever, and you get a little blood, they would put the blood in the seam of the garment. They would take it, like if you got like a, prick your finger, they would take it and they would put it in the seam of the garment. And it was believed that it was good luck. Now, I never did that because obviously sanitary, and you have, people wearing your garments. But you know what? If you want to do that for your ritual wear, if you do poke yourself, you know what? Put a little blood into it, because, you could put some goodwill, some good energy, and it was believed to be good luck. So do with that information what you will, but that is one of those superstitions that they had in the theater, among others. So now that I have this pinned, I'm going to sew again all along 5/8 all along there until we get our shoulder seams. And then I'll meet you back at the ironing board so that I can show you how we iron those seams open. Okie dokie, welcome back. Here we are at the ironing board. And so I have in my hand my coat, right? So if you look, I'm going to turn it so you can see me. So if you look, you'll see here's the coat, right? And I got the two parts, right? I got the middle part, which is where the head's going to go. And then I have the sleeves, and I have the sleeves. They look pretty big right now, right? So we're going to fix that in just a minute. But we have the seams we got to do something with. So we're going to come back to our ironing board, and we're going to do these seams. So the easiest way to do it is I just kind of put both of the seams on the ironing board. The sleeves, rather. So you got this sleeve. I take it, tuck it over. So now I got both of the sleeves on the ironing board. And the cool thing about this garment is that it, because it's so big and it's not small sleeves, you can drape the entire thing over. I'm just cutting off real quick, cutting off these little flyaways from where I sewed, because that's how you look like an amateur. Okay, so now we have it so that the seams are facing up. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, if you notice that there are two kind of flaps to the seam. Hold on, I'm trying to bring you down. There are two flaps to the seam. Okay, so we have the seam. I know it's a little dark, I do apologize. I apologize, it's not wanting to focus. Okay, whatever, this is as good as I'm going to get. Okay, so here are the two flaps, right? We got these two little flaps. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the iron, and we're going to iron the flaps open. So I try to iron like in front of the seam, and then I lay it flat, and I iron down. I'll do it the other way so you can see. I'll lay it flat, and I'll iron down the seam like that, if you can see that. So this does a couple of things. Like I said, number one, it gives it a nice clean look. It also opens the seams in a way that you're never going to be able to open again. So it's important that you do that. Now, if you remember, we sewed this part on, and then we sewed this part on. Well, you'll notice as you start to iron by that here in the middle where the neck would go, it wants to lay flat. So I'll go ahead and iron that flat because that is going to be the top part of the neck, and that'll be to our benefit later. Now, some people don't want to iron it open. They'll go ahead and iron it closed. But if you do that, you have to iron it open first. Otherwise, it's never going to look right. Because once it's ironed and sewn closed, or once it's sewn closed, you can't unsew it and iron it open, iron it flat, and then the seams will look a little junky. So I always go ahead and iron it like that. But for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and fold it forward. So I ironed it flat. Now I'm going to fold it forward, and I'm going to iron it down again. So then it's closed again. But I'm ironing it forward toward the front of the garment. That way, it actually, you know what? I'm not going to do that because I want to make sure I'm going to iron it back. Let's iron it back toward the back of the garment, because I want to keep that neckline the way that it was. So I apologize, I gave you the wrong information. Let's iron it flat to the back. So I ironed it open, and now I'm ironing it closed, flat to the back. And that gives that edge and that seam a nice rolled edge. And what I'll do is I'll actually go back over this and I'll top stitch, what's called top stitching. So I'll put it on my machine and I'll sew down. I'll put the edge of the presser foot right on this seam line and I'll sew it across. That way it keeps this down so that it looks nice and it keeps the seam looking nice. So I'm going to do that. I'm not going to show it because it's just a kind of an added feature. But again, I'm going to put it on the machine now that it's ironed flat, and I'm going to sew with my presser foot along that stitch line, and I'm going to just sew it all the way across, even over top where the neck would be, because what it's going to do is it's going to hold that seam down and make the neck look very finished from the outside, but on the inside it'll have that raw edge. So I'm going to just sew it down, and that gives it a little bit more stability. It also allows us the opportunity to add a little bit of a design element, so it'll have a stitch along the shoulders. So we're going to do that. After I do that, then we're going to pin the side seams together, and we're going to sew the side seams in the exact same way that we did this. So I'll see you back at the machine. We are back at the sewing table. Again, I apologize if these angles are just not to your liking. I know it's not the best. So what I've done at this point was I went ahead and I turned my stitch width up to make a nice big stitch, and I went ahead and I top stitched over this. So this is what the underside looks like, right? So we have, I'll bring it in. So we have the seam allowance has been folded up, so here's the original seam, and then this right here is the top stitch. So I've stitched it all along, and I've even gone all the way down this way over the neck, so now I've stitched down that piece, so it gives a nice finished edge. And when you fold it over, you have a nice finished edge. So I'll show you what that looks like a little bit closer. So this is what it looks on the top side, right? So we have, trying to do it in the light here. Oops, hold on. Oh, okay, I guess you can kind of see it. The light's kind of washing it out. So you have, this is the seam, and then this is the top stitch. So when you look at it, it has the top stitch, it has the neck right here, and then here's the other top stitch. So we have that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to turn it back inside out, and we're going to sew the arms. Now this is the part where the pattern, the original pattern, is probably more accurate than what I do, because the original pattern tells us to sew it. So here's the top, right? This is the top of the garment, and then this is the front going down the front, and then on this side here, this is where the armhole would be, right? So with the armhole, you're a little bit out of range here. Let me put you up a little bit. Okay. So this is the armhole right here. We're obviously not going to sew the armhole, right? We're going to leave that open. We're going to come down here, and we're going to match the sides and we're going to sew down the side seams, right? Now, the trick here is that we want to line these notches up, and we're going to pin with the notches lined up, right? And we're going to pin all the way down the side seam. Now, the other trick is, according to the original pattern, when you sew up the side seams, you actually sew up about 5/8 above here. So you want to sew up a little further. You don't want to stop right there. You want to sew up a little bit further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin the side seams on both sides down, and then I'm going to sew up the side seams, and then you'll see what we're left with. So we're about 3/4 of the way done with this garment already. Hello. We're about 3/4 of the way done with this garment already. So essentially the remaining things that we have to do is we have to sew the side seams. The front's already finished. The top is already finished. All we have to do now is we have to hem the bottom, and we have to do this design that I do with the sleeves. So essentially, if I can show you, pretend that this is the sleeve, right? This is the sleeve. This is the front right here. See, there's the part where it goes over your arm, like this is the armhole. What I do is I take, look how wide this is. This is obviously too wide for a person's shoulder. So what I do is I actually fold it under all the way up to where I started sewing. So it looks kind of like this, right? And when I do that, when we turn it right side out, it gives a little bit of definition to the shoulder, makes the shoulder look more square, and it adds that sort of flare, which is what I was looking for in the garment. So this is essentially what we're going to do with it. So I'm going to sew the side seams up, and then once I've sewed the side seams, we will do the shoulders. After we do the shoulders, then we'll just have to finish it by hemming the bottom. So we're almost done. Alright everyone, so up to this point, what I've done is I sewed the side seams like I said I was going to, and I left an opening here for the sleeves. So what I did was, after I sewed the side seams, I pressed the side seams open. So I laid it flat on my iron, and then I opened the seams and I ironed across the seams open. Now the reason why I did this on the side as opposed to doing it on the top is because of the way that it makes the shoulder seam or the shoulder arm hole look. So I have to keep it open. So I ironed it. Now, if you want, you can top stitch it like I showed you with the shoulder, but that's going to take time because you're going to have to sew both sides now, right? Before, when it was flapped over, you would just sew the one. Well, now you'd have to sew both. Unless you have a machine attachment that has 2 needles and you can do them at the same time, generally what happens is I just leave it open. So it's not going to make much of a difference because no one's going to see this seam on the inside. So again, I just ironed the seams flat, and now comes the exciting part, which is where I will start to do the shoulders. So this is how it's done. What I'm gonna, like I mentioned, I'm gonna keep it with the wrong side out, right? And this is one side of it here. Okay, so this is what it looks like. This is one side. This is the shoulder. Here's the opening for the shoulder. This is the wrong side. I'm gonna roll it under like this, and I'm gonna take this raw edge right here. That's the outside of the seam or the outside of the arm. I'm gonna roll it all the way up until we get to the facing, the edge of the facing. So I'm going to roll it all the way up to the edge of the facing, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten it out as best I can, take it over to my machine, and then I'm going to sew a top stitch, but I'm going to do it on the opposite side of the seam. So I'll show you what I mean. So if you remember from when we did the top stitch on the shoulder, we have the seam, we have the seam, and we have the top stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to top stitch, I'm so sorry, I'm going going to top stitch on the opposite side of the seam. So we have a top stitch there, I'm going to put a top stitch there, and it's just going to add a nice element, but I'm going to do that all the way across the top with this folded under, and that's going to give us a nice completed outer edge for our sleeve, and it's also going to add that fluffy shoulder cap that we're looking for. So I'm going to pin all that together and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so this is what it looks like now that I've pinned it. So just to give you some idea, this is the right side, this is the wrong side, and then this is the sleeve that I've rolled under. So now this is the right side of the sleeve that's rolled over onto the wrong side, okay? And what I did was, it's going to be hard to see, but I'll try my best. What I did was I lined up the top stitching from the right side, and you'll see how there's a running line of stitching going that way. So I lined it up so that the seam is lined up and so that the top stitching is lined up, right? So I've lined it all up. And then what I did was I simply just pinned it. This is the most advanced part of this whole project, is that I just pinned it across. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this sleeve, I'm going to put it on the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew it here. If you want, you can sew it right along the seam where we had the original seam. If you don't like that, you could actually, what I do is I sew it on the opposite side. So now when you look at the shoulders from the right side, it'll have 2 rows of running decorative stitching. So that's kind of a little design element. You don't have to do it that way. What you can just do is just sew it right. It's called stitch in the ditch. You can stitch right in the ditch of the seam, or of the seam, of the shoulder seam if you want. You don't have to, but again, I do that. So go ahead and sew the shoulder here, and then do the same thing on the other side. Sew the shoulders, and then when we turn it right side out, you'll see how it looks. Alrighty, okay, so now I have top stitched it along, right? And now that I've top stitched it along, I can turn it right side out. So it's not completed yet, but we're very, very close. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now turn it inside out, and I'm going to put it on so that you can see what it looks like. So now that I've turned it right side out, it has armholes, and I can easily put my sleeves, my arms through the sleeves. Now, one thing I've done in the past is I've finished those inside edges, but you don't really have to do that. So notice we got a couple of features here, right? We have the nice solid front going down, we have that nice line, and then we have that shoulder, right? That shoulder that's kind of like that, right? And so I've played around in the future with the idea of actually putting interfacing in the shoulders to give it more of that poof, kind of keep it up like that, but I think that it's just fine as it kind of slowly starts to kind of soften up a little bit. So that essentially is the coat, right? Now there's also another piece that goes with the coat. It's a clasped chain that connects it. It just keeps it connected so that you're not whipping around everywhere. But there's a couple other things we still have to do. So everything else is finished, except we have to do the hem at the bottom, which I'm short, so this is almost as tall as I am. We have to do the hem at the bottom, and then, which I'm going to show you a way using a special foot, which is my favorite part of this whole project, which is completing that hem at the bottom. So we have to do the hem at the bottom, and then there's a little sewing dart that I put in here, to kind of give it a little scrunched in so that it's a little bit more form-fitting right here under the arms. But other than that, the arms stay open. And then when you have your black robe, the robe goes through, and so you have this nice contrast of the black and the green there. But we're very, very close to being done. So this last part here that we have to do before we do the hem, which is we're 2 steps away from finishing this whole garment. The problem is that I don't have a, as you can see, I didn't wash this and my fingers are turning green. So if you don't want that to happen, wash your garment. Anyway, the issue here is that we add a kind of a dart here to kind of make it form-fitting, but I don't have any particular way that I do it. I kind of just make like an L-shaped and just kind of create it that way. So it's kind of like a dart, but I don't have any method for doing that. So I kind of just do it and see how it looks. So I'm going to explain to you how I do it, and then you can kind of do it the way that you need to. So for this part of the project, I do use tailor's tape. Tailor's chalk. You don't really need it, but it just helps me to kind of visualize what's going on. So I use my hem gauge and I use some tailor's chalk. This is what my tailor's chalk looks like. Again, you don't really need it. Now, here we are at the sleeve. So here's the sleeve. Technically, this is the raw edge right here, but it's folded inside. So what people are going to see on the outside is all finished, right? This is all finished. Now, the part that we're most interested in is down here at the very bottom of the sleeves opening. So I'm going to zoom you in so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so we have our side seam. We have this little notch part that looks like now it looks very squared, and then we have our sleeve. So what I do is I kind of put this together, and I've tried it different ways to see what I like. If you kind of hold the top, so you can see this a little better. If you kind of hold the top of the sleeve and you let it kind of hang naturally, it does kind of make this fold. Oh, you can barely see it. I apologize. It does kind of, so I have my arm in the sleeve, wrong side, right? It does kind of make this fold. It wants to kind of fold. So here's the opening, and then there's like this fold. But then down at the bottom, it's kind of just doing all kinds of weird stuff. So what I'll do is I've tried it where I've kind of pinned it together. This is called draping. So it's not a real art, it's more of a science. I'm sorry, it's not a science, it's more of an art. So it's called draping. So what I'll do is I'll kind of just let it hang. And then down here at the bottom where all this like ruffling comes together, I'll make sure that the seam is at the top, right? And then I'll kind of bring it down and then I'll tack it with a pin. After I pin it, then I'm going to create my thing. So it gives some nice layering here. See, there's different layers to it. It kind of adds these folds to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it down, and I'm going to bring you down, bringing you back down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it down, and I'm going to kind of pinch that seam so that it's flat like this, and then I'm going to keep that layering happening, and I'm going to pin it. So we're going to put a pin in there. This is kind of like replicating the look I want. So we're going to kind of put a pin in there. Okay, so now that we have that pin in there and we have these kind of this layering look, these kind of ruffles, these folds that I like this because it looks very Asian, very Asiatic, very much like, think of like the doublets or the coats that the samurai would wear, right? They have like that sharp shoulder, and then they have those things that come down. So what I do, and again, this is not a science, is I'll find the very bottom of my sleeve opening, and I will pin it there. And then what I do is I kind of make this L-shaped or like a triangular shaped dart, I guess is the best way to put it, going down kind of like this. And then I'll use the hem gauge, the straight edge of the hem gauge, and I'll kind of mark it. So using your tailor's chalk, I like it because it's flat, like it's like a straight line. I'll use the tailor's chalk and I'll kind of mark it. And then I'll use this, and again, there's really no method to my madness on this. I'll do about 2 inches. So I'll set it on 2 inches, and I'll mark it up 2 inches. And then I'll come to the edge here, and I'll mark it straight down. So it's kind of like a triangle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew it down and then up and off, kind of what they say, going off the cliff, right? So I'm going to sew it here, and then I'm going to put the presser foot up and leave the needle down in the machine, turn my work, and then I'm going to put the presser foot back down, and I'm going to sew it all the way off the cliff. And so it creates kind of a dart. And I know this is not how darts are normally done, and this is kind of like a backward dart, because normally doesn't matter. Darts go different than this. But this is generally how I do it. And that kind of gives it a little bit of a tuck in, kind of tacks it right there under the armpits, and then it allows this draping to happen. This is completely off the wall, and it's just the way I do it. So let's go ahead and sew it. I'm going to do the other side, and then we're going to come back and see what it looks like once it's all done. So I'm going to sew down here, back stitch, and then sew all the way down. Now this might be hard on your machine because some people's machines are a little different. And then once I get to the point, I'm going to put my needle down, I'm going to lift my foot up. Then I'm going to turn my work completely, so now it's going in the direction I want, and I'm going to sew it again, and I'm going to sew it back stitch, and then sew right off. And then I'm going to lift my foot, take that off, and now I have this triangle shaped dart. Okay, so I'm going to do that to the other side as well, and then I'm going to put it on. I'll show you what it looks like. So I'm back at the machine. Now in this way we're actually sewing through all of these layers of fabric, all of these layers, right? So what I'm doing is I'm putting it into the machine, and in this way we always sew away from us, right? So on this side I'm actually starting at the top of my triangle. I'm sewing down and then sewing off. We're going to do it the opposite way when I do the other sleeve, because again we're going away from this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start here. And if you want to do it the right way, you always want to dial down your stitches to make them smaller at the point. So we're going to go ahead and just sew it like this. Okay, so this is essentially what it looks like. So now we have this nice design. I have to move you back a little bit further because I'm too close. Okay, so we have this nice design. It still hangs pretty straight on the sides. We have the shoulders doing what they're supposed to do. We have the opening here, right? And then we have this nice straight kind of line here. We have this nice straight line here. We have this kind of straight curved line there. And then we also have it kind of cinched in a little bit. But we also have these really nice kind of designs across the top here. So essentially this is what it's going to look like when you're done with your coat. We have one thing left to do though, which is the hem on the bottom. And again, I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. But this ultimately is the shape that we're looking for. Okay, so we are at the home stretch. Now, there's many different ways that you can complete the hem of the garment. The person I'm making this garment for is tall, so I want to conserve as much as I can. You can fit it on your person, and if you decide that you need to cut it, you can cut it. I normally don't cut, especially when it comes to hems. If you want it to hang nice and kind of heavy on the bottom, some people will even put weights in their hem to keep it hanging nice and straight. Now, in this case, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do what's called a shirt tail hem. Essentially, a shirt tail hem is when you take I'm trying to show you as best I can. When you take the garment and you roll it once, and then you roll it again, right? So it creates a nice finished edge that you then sew over. Now you can do that by hand. In my case, I have a presser foot that's going to actually do the work for me, so I don't have to do it because it's time consuming. Or if you want, you could just fold it up once and just sew it like that, and that'd be the end of it for you. I like to have a nice finished edge though, so I'm going to use my presser foot, and it's going to roll it, and it's going to have a nice finished edge, and it's going to use very little fabric. If you are a short person and you got to hem it up 2 inches, then hem it up 2 inches. Whatever you got to do to make that edge not be unfinished like that. And this is the absolute last step that we have to do. The easiest thing to remember with this is that you are sewing away from yourself. So you need to start at the far edge of the garment, and you need to sew away from yourself. Remember, we're rolling on the wrong side, so I have the wrong side facing up, and I'm going to start the roll, and then as soon as I start it, the machine foot, which I've changed now, is going to do all the work for me. Now, this foot is the largest one that I have. I got a 3-pack online. They are kind of expensive, but I bought it online and it was a little bit cheaper. You don't have to use this if you don't want to. So this presser foot is kind of hard to use. So what I do is I will start it by doing a traditional shirt tail hem. So I'll roll it, and then I'll start it. And then what I'll do is I'll put the needle down all the way. I'll lift up the presser foot, and then I'll take the edge of the shirt tail hem and I'll kind of tuck it into this little loop-de-loop piece. Once you get it started, it kind of does its own thing. And then I'll put the foot back down. So now it's in the presser foot. It's kind of hard to see. This is the closest I gotcha. So what I'll do is I'll kind of feed it through and roll it with my left hand while I'm feeding it through. So watch. I'm going to slowly go. And as it goes, it looks like it's stuck a little bit because it's been, there we go. Ooh, there we go. Just needs a second to get started. And then as I go, I'm going to kind of roll it. And then as I'm going, I'm going to just keep rolling it. So the machine foot is going to do most of the work. It's kind of hard to see. I'm using this hand, and I'm rolling it, tucking it under, and I'm just going. And as I go, I'm going to kind of pull it a little bit tight. See how it started? And now that it's through this facing, it's going to sound less crazy. And I just roll it, and I just keep on going, just like that. I'm going to try to do it back here so you can see. And I just keep on going, and I just roll it, and I just roll it, and just let the machine roll for me. And I got myself a nice shirt tail hem at the end. And it's darn near perfect every single time. So what you're going to see, if I can show you, if you come over here, you'll see how it's nice and rolled. The edge is nice and rolled. That's a little wonky right there because that's where I had to start it. But the edge is nice and rolled, and I'm going to do this all the way around until I get to the other end, which is over here. And then once I finish this, I'm going to roll it, backstitch, and there goes the dog. And I'm going to backstitch, and then I'll be done. And then this garment will be absolutely complete. So let's check back here in a minute, and I'll be all done, and I'll show you what it looks like. And I am done. The goddess is good because I almost ran out of bobbin thread, and I made it just to the end. So this is what it looks like when it's done. A nice completed edge, perfectly aligned with the edge there, and it's a nice finished edge, and that goes all the way around the garment. So now we have it completely done, and what I like to do is I like to just hit it one last time with the iron on the hem to get it nice and soft with a nice crisp edge on the bottom, and then I will be done. So that essentially is the end of our tutorial on this garment.